She was 20 and adrift, no family safety net, no savings account, just a canvas duffel bag and a crumpled $4 bill hidden in her left shoe. And with that $4 she bought a rusted, soot-stained Dressmaker shop stranded in the industrial outskirts of Bristol County, Massachusetts, a building that vanished from tax maps in Munchin Tam Tam. The slate roof sagged under the weight of accumulated leaf. The tall windows were shattered, letting in the damp chill of the New England wind. The county had condemned it in Mortnin Chin Chin Mi Mort, with demolition scheduled following the first heavy thaw of spring. But what nobody knew was that inside the cavernous main room, sealed securely inside the hollow cast-iron leg of an antique treadle sewing machine that had not been moved in over 40 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe. And tell us in the comments where you're re-watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Hazel Vance had been bracing for impact her whole life without knowing it. Childhood had not been a place but a sequence of hurried departures. There were always eviction notices taped to peeling apartment doors, always landlord arguments overheard through thin drywall, always the hasty packing of cardboard boxes under the cover of night. By the time Hazel was 12, she knew how to pack her entire existence in under an hour. She kept exactly which items were worth carrying and which had to be left behind to lighten the load. The geography of her youth was mapped not by landmarks but by the steady hum of Greyhound bus engines and the neon glow of all-night diners off the interstate. Her mother, Diane, was a woman composed entirely of nervous energy and fractured hopes. She meant well, but she was always chasing a phantom stability that remained perpetually out of reach. Diane would find a job waitressing in a diner in Providence, only to lose it 3 months later because she could not afford the bus fare to get there. But the one constant in their nomadic life, the one anchor that Diane refused to abandon, was a battered Singer sewing machine. It was an old portable model, its black metal scarred by countless moves, its motor groaning "Ve kep ite" at every press of the pedal. It took both hands to carry it, and it cost more to transport than the value of all their other possessions combined. But Diane insisted. She said it was the only piece of their history that mattered. It was because of that sewing machine that Hazel learned the architecture of clothing. They had landed in a cramped, drafty apartment in Fall River, a town defined by its massive, silent textile mills. Diane, in a rare moment of financial flush, had taken Hazel to a small fabric remnant store. Behind the cutting counter stood a woman named Beatrice Hale. Beatrice arrived on a Tuesday afternoon to measure Hazel for a winter coat, carrying a worn leather measuring tape that hung around her neck like a stethoscope. She was a woman of deliberate, unhurried movements, her hands thick with calluses from years of pushing heavy wool under a needle, yet possessing a startling grace when they touched the fabric. Hazel, who usually retreated to her room when strangers appeared, found herself drawn to the cutting table. She watched from the doorway, fascinated by the gleaming silver shears, the specialized chalk, and the patient, almost reverent way Beatrice smoothed the heavy wool against the grain. She noticed Hazel standing there after 20 minutes. She did not ask her to leave. Instead, she motioned for her to come closer. "You have a quiet way about you," Beatrice had said. Her voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in her chest. A tailor needs quiet. Not just in the room, but in the mind. You have to listen to the drape of the fabric. That afternoon began an informal apprenticeship that anchored Hazel's turbulent teenage years. Every Saturday she would take the city bus to Beatrice's small cluttered workshop on the edge of town. It was a sanctuary of texture and precision. The air inside smelled of sizing starch, old iron, and the faint sweetness of machine oil. Beatrice taught her how to hold the heavy shears, how to feel the tension of the bias through the wooden handle, and how to strike the fabric with just enough force to make a clean, true cut. She taught her that a garment was not merely cotton and thread, but a living thing that breathed with the seasons, expanding in the humid summers and contracting in the dry winter. A garment never truly forgets the hands that made it, Beatrice told her once. carefully laying a strip of silk organza across a set of lapels. It holds the memory of its creation. Our job is not to force it to fit, but to remind it of the shape it was always meant to hold. But stability was a fragile thing in Hazel's life, and it shattered with a quiet, irreversible finality. Beatrice died on a cold November morning, an unexpected stroke that stopped her deliberate hands forever. Hazel was 18. The workshop was locked, its contents liquidated by a distant nephew who saw no value in the old patterns or the half-finished garments. The silver shears, the specialized chalk, the worn leather measuring tape, all of it vanished into the indifferent machinery of estate sale. Hazel stood across the street on the day they emptied the building, watching men carry out the heavy cutting tables and the bins of spare fabric. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in years. But the silence that settled over her that afternoon was dense and heavy, a profound stillness that she carried with her long after the delivery truck drove away. Then, her mother married a man named Arthur. Arthur was not a violent man, but he was a man who consumed space and air until there was nothing left for anyone else. He was a creature of rigid, unyielding habits. He worked as a shift supervisor at the local fast fashion garment factory, a massive, deafening operation that churned out thousands of J-hat-pay polyester shirts a day. His entire life was scheduled down to the minute. He demanded his coffee exactly at 6 in the morning in the same chipped ceramic mug, brewed to a precise bitter strength. He arranged the mail on the hallway table in neat, overlapping rectangles. He did not like noise. He did not like the sound of the television, the hum of the refrigerator, or the creak of the floorboards. Most of all, he did not like the old singer. The portable machine, which had survived a dozen moves and a decade of uncertainty, was a profound irritation to him. It took up 2 J-hat room in the cramped duplex they rented. It gathered dust. It was, in his view, a monument to impracticality. Hazel watched as Arthur's quiet resentment of the machine grew, manifesting in small, deliberate acts of marginalization. He began stacking old newspapers on the closed case. He used the foot pedal as a doorstop. He complained in a low, even tone about the draft that seemed to come from the wall behind it. Diane, weary and desperately clinging to the illusion of a stable marriage, yielded ground inch by inch. She stopped sewing. She stopped dusting the metal. The breaking point arrived 2 years later. The fast fashion factory, the economic engine that had sustained Fall River for the past decade, abruptly closed its doors. The operations were moved overseas, leaving hundreds of workers, including Hazel and Arthur, immediately unemployed. The severance was non-existent. The medical bills from Diane's lingering respiratory sickness piled up on the hallway table, disrupting Arthur's neat rectangles of mail. The atmosphere in the duplex grew suffocatingly tense. Hazel, now 20 and entirely jobless, felt the walls closing in. It happened on a Tuesday. Hazel returned from a futile morning of walking the industrial park looking for work, her feet throbbing, her coat smelling of damp wool and exhaust. The living room felt inexplicably larger. The space against the far wall was empty. The dust outline on the linoleum was the only evidence that the old singer had ever existed. Arthur was sitting in his recliner, reading the newspaper. He did not look up when she entered. The rent had to be paid, he said, his voice flat, devoid of apology. A man came with a truck this afternoon. It covered the landlord and the pharmacy. Hazel stared at the empty space. She could see the faint indentations the heavy rubber feet had left in the floor. She walked into her small bedroom. She pulled her canvas duffel bag from the closet and began to pack. She folded her 2 pairs of jeans, her 3 shirts, and the small sewing kit Beatrice had given her years ago. She took the crumpled $4 bill she kept hidden inside her left shoe, her absolute emergency fund, and placed it in her jacket pocket. She walked back into the living room. Arthur turned a page of the newspaper. "Mot am leaving," Hazel said. Arthur did not look up. "Leave the key on the counter." She left the key next to the ceramic mug. She walked out the door and did not look back. The next 6 weeks were a blur of cold nights and transient exhaustion. Hazel became a ghost in her own life, drifting through a landscape of bus terminals and all-night laundromats. She rode the local transit as far as a handful of change would take her, moving aimlessly across county lines, seeking only anonymity and a place out of the wind. She spent a week in New Bedford sleeping in the back booth of a diner, where a sympathetic waitress let her stay until the morning rush. She spent 2 weeks in Taunton walking the industrial waterfront, her hands shoved deep into her jacket pockets, listening to the metallic groan of the shipping crane. The money dwindled with brutal predictability. Every cup of black coffee, every packaged sandwich from a vending machine, chipped away at her meagre reserves. She learned to calculate survival in increments of quarters and dimes. She learned the exact locations of public restrooms with warm water, the hours when library security guards changed shifts, and the specific corners of transit stations where the security cameras did not point. The nights were the hardest. The cold crept into her bones, settling there like a permanent ache. She slept sitting up, her arms wrapped around her duffel bag, her senses dialed to a heightened, exhausting state of alertness. By the end of October, the autumn frost had arrived, and she was down to the $4 bill folded inside her shoe. The industrial park where the garment factory had stood was a sprawling complex of corrugated steel and cracked asphalt on the outskirts of Fall River. Hazel walked its perimeter every morning for a week, her thin canvas jacket offering little protection against the damp November wind off the Taunton River. The gates to the massive complex were padlocked, secured with heavy, rust-resistant chains. Inside, the loading docks where diesel trucks used to idle 24 hours a day were entirely empty. The sheer scale of the abandonment was difficult to process. The factory had employed nearly 1,000 people across 3 shifts. Now the only sound was the metallic clatter of loose cyclone fencing vibrating in the wind. She visited the employment office downtown, a crowded dispiriting room filled with the same people she had seen working the sewing lines and the shipping bays. The air in the office was thick with a quiet, desperate anxiety. The clerks behind the reinforced glass counters were overwhelmed, handing out stacks of identical application forms for jobs that simply did not exist. The Region S economy had been singularly dependent on the textile and garment industry. When the primary engine stopped, the secondary businesses, the diners, the laundromats, the local hardware stores, began to immediately suffocate. Hazel sat in a plastic chair near the back of the room, clutching her numbered ticket. The number was Bournemere High. The digital display above the counter read Tammy Bay. She watched a man with greying hair, a former floor manager she recognized from the factory, argue quietly but fiercely with a clerk about his severance package. The clerk simply pointed to a pre-printed sign on the glass. There was no severance. The parent company had filed for bankruptcy protection before moving the machinery overseas. She didn't wait for her number to be called. She walked out of the office and headed toward the river. She walked along the rusted train tracks that serviced the old mills, her head down, her hands shoved deep into her pockets. She watched the dark, freezing water of the river moving steadily toward the bay. The current was powerful and indifferent, a stark contrast to the stagnant, paralyzed feeling that had gripped the town. It was during these long, aimless walks that the reality of her situation began to crystallize. The safety net was not merely frayed, it had been entirely removed. She could not rely on the fragile, temporary solutions that had characterized her childhood with her mother. There would be no waitressing jobs, no Hehape apartments to rent for a few months before the inevitable eviction. She was entirely untethered. The realization brought a cold, terrifying clarity. She had to move, but she had nowhere to go. She returned to the duplex that evening to find Arthur S. suitcases packed by the door and the outline of the sewing machine in the dust on the floor. It was in the basement of a public library in Providence that she saw the advertisement. It was a Tuesday afternoon, raining heavily, and the library offered a dry sanctuary. Hazel sat at a scratched wooden table, absently flipping through a stack of old regional newspapers bound with twine, items slated for recycling. The paper was the Bristol County Gazette, dated 3 weeks prior. The classified section was mostly foreclosure notices and used car sales, but near the bottom of the page, boxed in a thin black border, was a notice of municipal tax auction. The listing was brief, precise, and devoid of sentiment. Property No. 204C. Tarmitam Water Street, Fall River. Former commercial structure dressmaking and alterations. Delinquent taxes bunkum dola. County scheduled demolition. Sealed bids accepted. Hazel stared at the words dressmaking and alterations. The phrase jumped off the newsprint, a sudden sharp echo of a life she had thought permanently closed. She read the address. Fall River was a town of ghosts, its skyline dominated by the massive silent granite textile mills that had once driven the region economy. It was a place built on fabric and thread, on the labour of thousands, a place that had been steadily quietly contracting for decades. She touched the side of her shoe. She had exactly $4. It was an irrational thought, a desperate grasp at an impossible lifeline. She had no vehicle, no tools, no winter coat, and no prospect of income. The building was likely a ruin, a condemned shell waiting for the wrecking ball. But the memory of Beatrice Hale's quiet workshop, the smell of sizing starch and old wool, the deliberate, patient work of giving a garment its true shape, it rose in her mind with a sudden, overwhelming clarity. It was a clarity that cut through the numbness of the past 6 weeks. She walked to the librarian's desk. She borrowed a pen and a single sheet of blank paper. She wrote her name, the property number, and a bid of exactly $4. She folded the paper, placed it in an envelope, and spent her last 75 cents in loose change on postage. She dropped the envelope into the brass mail slot near the library entrance. She had cast a line into the dark, not knowing what, if anything, she might pull back. The journey back to the city of Mills was about to begin. The notification arrived general delivery to the Providence post office 14 days later. It was a single, crisp sheet of county letterhead stating that her bid had been accepted, pending immediate signature and payment in person. She had 3 days to claim the deed. The journey north into Massachusetts took 2 days of walking along state highways and crumbling shoulder roads, navigating a coastal landscape that grew greyer and more desolate heart every mile. The November wind carried a biting chill straight off Mount Hope Bay, sweeping down through the bare oak and maple trees. The New England winter was approaching rapidly, a wet, heavy cold that did not merely settle on the skin but seemed to penetrate the bone. Hazel walked until her boots wore thin hitching rides when she could keep pet hat, passing delivery vans and the occasional fisherman heading back to port, always careful to sit close to the door, always keeping her duffel bag firmly in her lap. On the first night she slept in an abandoned boat shed off Route Mokbar-Missow, burrowing deep into a pile of dry, dusty canvas sailcloth to escape the frost that coated the marsh grass in pale silver by morning. She listened to the wind rattling the loose wooden siding, a harsh rhythmic thud that offered no comfort. The physical reality of the journey from Providence to Fall River was a study in endurance. The distance on a map was barely 20 miles, a negligible drive in a heated car, but on foot and relying on sporadic, unreliable transit, it was an exhausting slog. Hazel spent the first night of the journey in the abandoned boat shed off Route Mokbar-Missow, but the second day proved far more difficult. The weather turned violently. The grey leaden sky that had hung over the region for days finally opened up, releasing a freezing, driving rain that swept sideways across the coastal road. The rain was heavy and relentless, instantly soaking through Hazel's thin canvas jacket and saturating her jeans. The cold water seeped into her boots, numbing her toes until she could no longer feel them hitting the pavement. She walked with her head down, her chin tucked into her collar, using her duffel bag as a meagre shield against the wind. She attempted to hitchhike, standing on the narrow shoulder of the state highway and holding her thumb out as the occasional vehicle sped past, but the drivers, peering through rapidly sweeping windshield wipers, did not stop. A soaking wet, exhausted figure standing in the rain did not inspire charity. It inspired a cautious acceleration. The spray from the passing truck tires hit her in heavy, icy sheets, adding insult to the profound physical misery. By mid-afternoon, her core temperature had dropped dangerously low. She was shivering uncontrollably, a violent, full body tremor that made her teeth chatter loud enough to hear over the wind. The landscape around her was desolate, long stretches of bare, wind-whipped marshland and closed, seasonal seafood shacks with their windows boarded up tight. She saw a small independent gas station ahead, its faded sign creaking on rusty hinges. She pushed herself toward it, her legs feeling like lead weights. The small convenience store attached to the pumps was brightly lit. Hazel pushed open the glass door, a puddle of water immediately forming around her boots on the linoleum floor. The clerk behind the counter, a young man wearing a heavy fleece pullover, looked up from a magazine. He took in her soaked clothing, her blue lips, and the way she gripped the edge of a chip display rack to steady herself. "Mort met sorry," Hazel managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "Mort just. Mort need to stand inside for a minute." The clerk didn't hesitate. He walked out from behind the counter, locked the front door, and flipped the sign to closed. He went into a small back room and returned with a heavy, dry woolen blanket and a large styrofoam cup-filled vei capite hot black coffee from the commercial brewer. "Sit down by the radiator," he said, pointing to an old cast-iron unit against the far wall. "Wrap that around you." Hazel sat on the floor, leaning against the hot iron ribs of the radiator. She wrapped the blanket tightly around her shoulders, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the coffee cup. She stayed there for 2 hours, watching the rain hammer against the store windows, slowly absorbing the heat until the violent shivering subsided into a dull, exhausted ache. The clerk never asked her name, never asked where she was going, and never asked for money for the coffee. When the rain finally slowed to a manageable drizzle, she folded the blanket, placed it on the counter, and thanked him. She stepped back out into the fading light, her clothes still damp but her core warm, and continued walking toward the river. She arrived in Fall River on a Thursday afternoon under a sky the colour of old lead. The town sat on a steep hill overlooking the Taunton River, a grid of brick and asphalt laid over the uneven terrain, dominated by the hulking granite silhouettes of the textile mills. It was a place that felt solid, weathered, and stubbornly resilient. As Hazel walked down the main commercial thoroughfare, she noted the businesses that had survived the economic shifts of the late 20th century. There was a hardware store with window displays of heavy canvas tarps and marine rope, a diner advertising hot clam chowder, a narrow pharmacy with a faded red awning, a small independent bank constructed of heavy limestone block, and a cobbler shop smelling strongly of rubber cement and leather dye. The people on the sidewalks moved with purpose, heads down against the wind, wearing heavy wool coats and thick knit caps. The Bristol County Clerk's Annex stood near the centre of town, a formidable structure of grey granite with heavy brass doors that seemed to guard the history of the city. Hazel climbed the wide, worn steps, her legs heavy, her duffel bag strap cutting into her shoulder. The interior of the building was cavernous and quiet, smelling of floor wax, aged paper, and the metallic tang of old radiators. The marble floors echoed with her footsteps. She followed the brass plaques on the wall until she found the property records office on the second floor. She pushed open the heavy oak door. The office was warm, the air thick and still. Behind a long wooden counter sat a woman in her late 50s wearing a knitted cardigan over a floral blouse. Her glasses were attached to a delicate beaded chain resting around her neck. A black plastic nameplate on the counter read, "Martha Higgins, County Clerk." Martha looked up from a stack of manila folders, her eyes settling on Hazel's worn boot, her thin jacket, and the canvas bag. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a practiced, bureaucratic assessment. "Can Mott help you?" "Hon?" Martha asked, her voice carrying the flat, distinct vowels of coastal Massachusetts. "Mott met here for a property," Hazel said, her voice raspy from the cold air and disuse. She pulled the folded county letter from her pocket and slid it across the smooth wood. "Number 204C. Water Street." Martha adjusted her glasses, peering at the letter. She looked at the letter, then at Hazel, and then back at the letter. She sighed, a soft sound of weary resignation, and walked over to a wall of grey metal filing cabinets. She pulled open a heavy drawer, her fingers walking over the tabs until she extracted a thick, dust-covered file. She brought it to the counter and opened it flat. Hazel Vance, Martha said, reading the name aloud. She looked at Mott for Hazel over the rims of her glasses. You understand what you re-buying here, hon? This is Tia House. It's a commercial shell. It hasn't had electricity or running water since Motninchintum Tam. The roof is giving way, the foundation is cracked, and the county was fixing to tear it down come April. Mott understand, Hazel said. The back wall is mostly gone, Martha continued, her tone pressing, trying to impart the reality of the situation. Kids have been getting in there for years. There's no heat. You can live in a commercial structure without an occupancy permit, and the inspector isn't going to grant one for a building without plumbing. Yes, ma'am, Hazel said. It's a liability, Martha said gently. A pile of bricks and rot. You retaking on the demolition cost if you can bring it up to code. What understand, Hazel repeated. She reached into her pocket. She withdrew the crumpled $4 bill, smoothing it out carefully on the counter, pressing her fingers against the creases. She pushed it toward Martha. Martha looked at the bill. She looked at Hazel S. determined, exhausted face. She reached for a brass ink stamp. The brass stamp came down on the transfer document with a heavy final thud. Martha signed her name with quick, efficient strokes of a blue ballpoint pen. She slid the deed, a single piece of heavy stock paper, across the counter. Hazel took it. It felt substantial, a physical weight that anchored her to this town, to this coastline. Water Street is down on the south end near the old textile mills, Martha said, pointing a pen toward the frosted glass window. You follow the river until you hit the iron bridge, then take a left. It's the last building on the right before the marsh starts. You can miss it. It's the one that looks like it's about to fall over. Hazel folded the deed carefully and placed it in her pocket. Thank you. She turned to leave, but Martha spoke again. Vance, Martha said, her brow furrowing slightly as she looked back down at the open file. Hazel Vance. You any relation to Beatrice Hale? She used to do business with an Arthur Vance out near Providence. Years ago. Sent piecework out that way. Hazel stopped. The name in this distant office hit her like a physical blow. She turned back slowly. Beatrice Hale was. She taught me. Before she died. Arthur is my stepfather. Martha's expression softened, the bureaucratic distance melting into a quiet, recognizable empathy. She looked at the $4 bill resting on the counter, then back at Hazel. Beatrice was a good woman, Martha said quietly. Quiet but good. She came through here a few times in the 70s, looking for specific heavy wool yardage from the old looms. Said this town had a history of making fabric that lasted a lifetime. If she taught you, then you know how to use your hand. She pushed a small ring of rusted keys across the wood. These are the padlock keys for the front doors. Be careful, hon. The floors are treacherous. Hazel took the keys. They were cold and heavy. Mott will. The walk to Water Street took 40 minutes. She followed the rusted railroad tracks that ran parallel to the Taunton River, stepping over cracked wooden ties and scattered gravel. The industrial hum of the town faded, replaced by the sound of the wind moving through the barren oak trees and the harsh cries of seagulls. She passed a row of massive abandoned textile mills, their thousands of windows dark and broken, monuments to a bygone era of American manufacturing. The trees bordering the road were predominantly oak and white pine, their branches stark and leafless against the grey sky. As she passed beneath the iron bridge, the road narrowed, the pavement fracturing into dirt and weeds. The area felt abandoned, a forgotten margin of the town where industry had slowly retreated, leaving behind the husks of its past. And then she saw it. It sat at the very end of the road, backed up against a steep wooded incline leading down to the salt marsh. It was a narrow 2-story structure built of dark red brick, its facade obscured by overgrown ivy and wild sumac. The wood trim around the tall, narrow windows was completely stripped of paint, weathered to a pale bone grey. The roofline dipped ominously in the centre, a structural fatigue that spoke of heavy snows and neglected maintenance. A faded, hand-painted sign above the double front doors was barely legible, the white paint flaking away to reveal the brick beneath it read, B. Hale, Dressmaker and Bespoke Tailoring. Hazel stood in the dirt road staring at the building. It was a cavernous space that seemed to swallow the dim afternoon light. It was, as Martha had warned, a ruin. The scale of the decay was overwhelming, a physical manifestation of decades of silence and neglect. But as Hazel looked at the faded sign, at the tall windows that once let in the morning sun, she did not feel despair. She felt a strange quiet recognition. She walked up to the front doors. They were secured by a heavy iron chain and a rusted brass padlock. She selected the largest key from the ring Martha had given her. It slid into the lock with a scraping sound. She turned it. The mechanism resisted for a moment, then yielded with a heavy click. She pulled the chain free. It fell to the concrete step with a loud clatter. She placed both hands against the wooden doors and pushed. They opened with a long, agonizing groan of neglected hinges. The air that met her was violently cold, carrying the unmistakable scent of deep abandonment. It smelled of dry rot, pigeon droppings, rusted iron, and the sharp acidic tang of decaying wool. Hazel stepped across the threshold, her boots crunching on broken glass and fallen plaster. The main room was vast, the ceiling stretching up 14 feet, supported by heavy timber trusses. The light was dim, filtering through the grime-caked windows, illuminating floating dust motes that danced in the still air. The space was a graveyard of ambition. In the centre of the room sat 3 massive oak cutting tables, their smooth surfaces scarred by thousands of shear marks and completely covered in debris. Rusted dress forms stood in the corners like silent headless sentinels. Rows of wooden spools, long stripped of their thread, lay scattered across the floor like fallen dominoes. In the far corner, looming in the shadows, was the heavy cast-iron base of an antique treadle sewing machine, its wooden cabinet long rotted away but its metal frame enduring the decades of dampness. Hazel walked slowly through the room, her senses overwhelmed. She ran her hand along the edge of a cutting table. The wood was solid oak, deeply scarred by years of use. She found a side door that led to a smaller room, a former office or fitting room. It was bare, save for an overturned wooden chair and a rusted metal desk. The floorboards here were relatively intact, though they creaked ominously under her weight. The sun began to dip behind the mill buildings across the river, and the temperature inside the shop plummeted. The cold was a physical presence pressing against her from all sides. Hazel returned to the smaller room. She cleared a space on the floor, sweeping away the worst of the debris with a piece of scrap wood. She set her duffel bag down and sat against the wall. She had no heat, no light, and no food. The wind picked up, howling through the broken windows in the main room, creating a low moaning sound that resonated through the empty dress form. She zipped her jacket up to her chin and pulled her knees to her chest. The darkness was absolute. She listened to the sounds of the building settling, the wood shifting as the temperature dropped. It was a terrifying, isolating symphony of decay. Yet, as she closed her eyes, the panic that had chased her for 6 weeks did not arrive. The fear of eviction, the tension of Arthur's quiet rage, the exhausting hypervigilance of the streets, all of it seemed to stop at the heavy wooden doors. She was cold and she was hungry, and she was entirely alone in a ruined building on the edge of a forgotten town. But the space belonged to her, the silence belonged to her. She laid her head against the canvas duffel bag. She listened to the wind moving through the rafters. A slow, rhythmic breathing. Some trades are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The first 3 days were dedicated entirely to the blunt mechanics of survival. Hazel woke on the first morning with a stiffness in her joints that made every movement an effort of will. The light in the back room was thin and grey, offering no warmth. She spent the morning exploring the exterior of the property. Behind the building, half hidden by a thick tangle of dormant blackberry brambles, she found a narrow brick outhouse. The wood was silvered with age, but the structure remained sound. Further back, near the property line where the marsh began, she found an old hand pump well. The cast-iron handle was frozen solid with rust. She spent an hour striking it rhythmically with a heavy piece of firewood, working the rust loose until with a sudden agonizing shriek of metal the handle gave way. The first few pumps brought up a sludge of brown water, but after 20 minutes of steady effort, the water ran clear and agonizingly cold. It tasted strongly of minerals and iron, but it was clean. Inside, she mapped the hazards of her new domain. She walked the floorboards of the main room with deliberate caution, memorizing the groans and the sudden, terrifying soft spots where the wood had succumbed entirely to rot. She learned Verkehrt paths were safe, and which sections of the floor were structurally compromised. She spent hours sweeping the main aisle with a broom she fashioned from pine branches and twine, moving the heaviest debris into the corner. It was exhaustive, physical labor that left her hands raw and her muscles burning, but it provided a distraction from the gnawing ache in her stomach. By the end of the 3rd day, she knew she had to venture back into town. The first night inside the dressmaker's shop was an exercise in sensory deprivation and acoustic magnification. As the final light of the evening faded from the shattered windows, the darkness inside the cavernous main room became absolute. Hazel retreated to the small back office, the only space where she felt a minimal sense of containment. She sat on the floor, leaning back against her canvas duffel bag, pulling her thin jacket tightly around her shoulders. The cold here was not like the cold of the open streets. It was a trapped, stagnant chill, the accumulated frost of a building that had not seen a fire in decades. It seemed to seep upward from the floorboards, settling into her bones with a heavy leaden ache. With her vision entirely useless, her hearing compensated with terrifying acuity. The building was an acoustic amplifier. The heavy timber trusses supporting the roof groaned continuously under the invisible weight of the wind moving off the Taunton River. The sound was not a simple creak, but a deep, resonant moan, like the hull of a massive wooden ship under strain. A loose piece of tin flashing on the exterior wall flapped rhythmically against the brick, a sharp metallic percussion that marked the passage of the hours. Sometime after midnight, she heard the distinct sound of something moving inside the walls. It was a rapid, scurrying scratch, the unmistakable noise of rodents navigating the hollow spaces between the lath and plaster. The sound travelled the length of the main room, pausing, then continuing with frantic energy. It was a stark reminder that the building had long ago been reclaimed by the natural environment, that she was the intruder in a space that had established its own ecosystem of decay and survival. She did not sleep. She drifted in and out of a shallow, shivering exhaustion, constantly pulled back to consciousness by a new sound or a sudden drop in the temperature. She concentrated on her breathing, trying to slow her heart rate, using a technique Beatrice Hale had taught her when she had been anxious about cutting a particularly expensive piece of silk. Focus on the inhalation, Beatrice had said, her hands resting calmly on the cutting table. The panic lives in the shallow breaths. Breathe from the diaphragm. When the first pale grey light of dawn finally began to filter through the grime-caked windows, outlining the rusted dress forms in the corners of the main room, Hazel felt a profound, exhausting sense of victory. She had survived the night. The building had not collapsed. She had not been discovered. She stood up, her joints protesting with stiff, agonizing pops. She walked into the main room, her breath plumbing in the freezing air, and looked at the massive oak-cutting tables. The terror of the night receded, replaced by the sheer imposing reality of the physical labor that lay ahead. She walked the 1.5 miles back to the commercial district, her steps measured. She sought out the hardware store she had seen on her first day. The sign above the door read Hanson & Sons Supply. A bell attached to the heavy glass door chimed as she entered. The store smelled of machine oil, fertilizer, and fresh-cut lumber. The aisles were narrow, packed floor to ceiling with every conceivable tool and material. Behind the front counter stood a man in his late 60s. He wore heavy denim overalls over a thermal shirt, his forearms thick and corded with muscle. His hands were stained with grease that no amount of scrubbing would ever fully remove. His expression was serious, the lines around his eyes etched deep by years of squinting into the sun or focusing on small, precise tasks. He watched her approach, taking in her thin jacket and her exhausted face. "Help you find something?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, carrying the same unhurried cadence as Martha, the county clerk. "Mott need supplies," Hazel said, keeping her voice steady. "But Mott don't have money to pay you today." Mott bought the old Dressmaker S shop on Water Street from the county. Mott need materials to secure it. The man leaned against the counter. He looked at her for a long silent moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. He was not a man given to sudden decisions or emotional charity. He was assessing her, weighing the risk of a stranger against the unwritten codes of a town that survived by mutual reliance. "That building's been empty since '88, he said finally. "Roof S shot. Floors are a trap." "What can know vekep," Hazel said. He nodded slowly. "Name's Elias. Elias Hansen. My father owned this store. He sold supplies to Beatrice Hale when she built that shop." He reached under the counter and pulled out a heavy ledger bound in green canvas. He opened it to a blank page. He took a pencil from behind his ear. "What S the name?" He wrote it down with deliberate strokes. "This isn't tea charity. Vance. It S a ledger account. You pay when you can. But you pay." Elias closed the ledger. "You look lung need a hammer. Nails. Tarp for the roof. Some heavy plastic for the windows." He turned and walked into the aisles. Hazel followed him. He moved with an efficient, practiced grace, pulling items from shelves and bins. "My brother Tom, he passed 2 years back," Elias said quietly as he handed her a roll of thick plastic sheeting. "He was a carpenter, kept meticulous notes, left behind a box of manuals, old framing techniques, roof repair, plastering, things people don't much use anymore. You want and they yours, no charge for those." "Mott would appreciate that," Hazel said. They returned to the counter. Elias tallied the items on a small paper pad. "A framing hammer mui hai $5 £5 of tamde galvanized nails born beta $9. A heavy-duty utility knife $6 3 rolls of sawmill plastic sheeting mui tam $10. A staple gun mui born $10. And 2 boxes of staples $9. 2 large canvas tarps bami haichum $10. The total came chimbachum tam $9. He wrote the amount in the green ledger. "You take these," Elias said, handing her 2 thick, spiral-bound notebooks from beneath the counter. The covers were stained verkeptehat coffee and wood glue. "Read the section on roof joists before you try fixing that sag. Wood talks before it breaks. You just have to know how to listen." Hazel carried the heavy bags of supplies back to Water Street. The physical exertion was intense, the bags cutting into her fingers, but the weight felt like progress. She spent the next 2 days stapling the thick plastic sheeting over the shattered windows, sealing out the worst of the New England wind. The shop grew darker, the light filtering through the plastic casting a diffuse milky glow over the ruined cutting tables. The temperature inside remained bitterly cold, but the biting drafts were gone. The next critical task was the brick chimney that serviced a large cast-iron wood stove in the corner of the main room. Hazel found a thick coil of heavy hemp rope and a bundle of rigid wire brushes in a forgotten cabinet under one of the workbenches. Elias S. Brother S. notebook contained a detailed section on masonry maintenance. She carried the tools to the roof, climbing the precarious, rotting exterior stairs with deliberate care. The view from the roof was expansive, a sea of bare trees and grey rooftops stretching toward the Taunton River. She began the laborious process of sweeping the chimney. The flue was completely choked with decades of hardened creosote and debris. She tied the wire brushes to the rope, adding a heavy iron window weight to the end to pull the bristles down the shaft. She lowered the apparatus into the dark opening, feeling the immediate resistance. She pulled the rope up a foot, then dropped it too, grinding the wire bristles against the narrow brick walls. Black soot billowed from the opening, coating her hands and face in a fine, greasy dust. It was exhausting, repetitive work. She spent 4 hours on the roof, hauling the heavy rope up and down, her muscles burning, her breath plumbing in the frigid air. The sound of the wire scraping against brick echoed down into the cavernous shop below. Only when the brushes moved freely, without snagging on hardened deposits, did she stop. She climbed down, her entire body aching. She opened the heavy iron door of the wood stove and shoveled out mounds of dislodged soot and ash. She carried the buckets outside, dumping them into the bramble. When the firebox was finally clear, she gathered dry kindling from the surrounding woods, snapped oak twigs, peeling birch bark, and brittle pine needles. She arranged them carefully in the center of the stove, striking a long wooden match against the iron side. The birch bark caught instantly, the flame curling upward. She added larger pieces of split hickory she found stacked against the back wall. The fire caught. The draft pulled the smoke up the newly cleared chimney with a low, satisfying roar. Hazel sat on the floor in front of the stove, feeling the radiant heat push against the profound chill of the room. It was the first true warmth she had felt in weeks. She had stopped at a small grocery on her way back from the hardware store, using the last of $1 she found on the street to buy a cup of hot water and a small packet of instant oatmeal. She boiled the water in a rusted tin cup balanced carefully on the flat top of the stove. She ate the oatmeal slowly, feeling the heat travel down her throat and settle in her stomach. The wood stove popped and hissed, casting flickering orange shadows against the tall brick walls. The cavernous shop felt slightly less empty. With the building minimally secured and a source of heat established, Hazel turned her attention to the contents of the shop. She began a slow, methodical inventory of the cutting tables and the scattered debris. It was a process of excavation, peeling back layers of dust and neglect to reveal the history of the space. She found rows of small glass jars filled with specialized buttons, brass hooks and eyes, and tiny precision-cut snaps. She catalogued heavy wooden rulers, their measurements faded but accurate, and specialized chalk wheels designed specifically for marking delicate fabrics. There were rolls of pure cotton interfacing in varying thicknesses, though most had been heavily damaged by dampness. She moved methodically, item by item, sorting the salvageable from the ruin. The process brought a deep, unexpected comfort. The tools, even the broken ones, spoke a language she understood. They were designed for a specific, delicate purpose. She found a heavy Taylor S-ham, its canvas cover stained but the sawdust stuffing still firm and precise. She held it in her hand, feeling its weight, remembering the way Beatrice Hale had taught her to use it to press curved seams. She placed it carefully on a cleared section of table. Her inventory brought her, inevitably, to the dismantled treadle sewing machine in the far corner. It was a massive, imposing structure of heavy cast iron. The wooden cabinet and the machine head had long since rotted away or been removed. What remained was the complex mechanical heart of the stand, the large drive wheel, the heavy foot treadle, and the ornate cast iron legs. The right leg was a thick, hollow column heavily constructed, designed to support the massive weight of the machine. Hazel knelt beside it, running her hand along the cold, blackened iron. The casting was extraordinary, the floral motifs sharp and precise. She tapped the iron lightly with her knuckles. It produced a solid metallic ring. She moved her hand further along the leg, tapping again. The sound changed. It became slightly duller, lacking the deep resonance of the rest of the structure. She frowned. A cast iron leg was by design a uniform hollow space. The acoustic signature should not change dramatically from one section to another. She tapped again, moving her knuckles inch by inch along the heavy iron column. The anomaly was located near the base, a section roughly 8 inches high. She leaned closer. The grime lay thick across the metal, undisturbed. But as she rubbed the dirt away with the sleeve of her jacket, she noticed a faint, perfectly straight seam cut into the iron. It was almost invisible, following the cast floral pattern with astonishing precision. She pressed against the metal. It did not yield. She retrieved a heavy flathead screwdriver from the workbench and gently tapped the area around the seam. The sound was unmistakably flat. Something solid was directly behind the panel. She examined the edges closely. There were no hinges, no visible latches. It was a completely sealed compartment. She knelt on the cold floor, running her fingers over the surrounding iron. Below the seam, barely noticeable in the shadows of the casting, was a small, slotted depression, perfectly sized for a specialized tool or a thick coin. Hazel stood up. She walked to the workbenches and began searching through the jars of brass hardware and the piles of miscellaneous parts. It took her 20 minutes to find what she was looking for, a heavy forged steel bobbin winder key, flat and thick. She carried it back to the treadle base. She placed the flat edge into the depression to fit Vekepite at absolute precision. She gripped the metal and twisted. There was a sharp click followed by the sound of a heavy internal latch sliding free. Hazel took a deep breath. She pulled. The heavy iron panel came away in her hands, revealing a dark, cylindrical cavity within the leg of the stand. She reached into the dark space. The air inside the compartment was remarkably dry, carrying the sharp, clean scent of oiled leather. Her fingers brushed against heavy canvas. She carefully withdrew the first item. It was a thick, oiled canvas roll, tied securely with leather thong. She placed it on the floor and untied the bindings. The canvas unfurled, revealing a complete set of master-grade tailoring tools. They were magnificent. The handles of the heavy fabric shears were forged from solid brass, polished to a deep, lustrous shine by years of use. The steel blades were unblemished, gleaming brightly in the dim light. There were specialized point turners, French curves made of solid brass, heavy glass pattern weights, and a perfectly balanced rotary cutter that felt like a natural extension of her hand. These were not the tools of a casual seamstress. They were the instruments of a master tailor, preserved with meticulous, almost reverent care. She reached into the cavity again. She pulled out a large, heavy bundle wrapped in thick brown waxed paper. The paper crackled loudly in the quiet room as she opened it. Inside were stacks of pristine hand-drafted clothing patterns. They were drawn on heavy, translucent vellum, the pencil lines sharp and precise. There were patterns for double-breasted wool overcoats, bias-cut silk gowns and structured linen suits. It was a treasure trove of design architecture, a complete masterclass in garment construction. Hazel reached into the compartment a third time. Her hand found a heavy metal box, cold to the touch. It was an old cigar tin. The painted label faded and chipped, secured with a heavy wire latch. She pulled it out and set it carefully beside the tools. She released the latch. It snapped open with a sharp, metallic crack. Inside the tin, sitting atop a neatly folded stack of currency, was a heavy silver thimble deeply engraved with a floral motif. Beside it was a silver military medal attached to a faded ribbon, the bronze star tarnished black with age. Hazel carefully lifted the paper currency. The bills were old, the paper crisp and thick. There were $20 bills with the faces of presidents long past, their margins yellowed. She counted them slowly, her hands trembling slightly. 100, 200, 500. The total came to exactly $712. The coins were heavy silver half-dollars and worn Liberty dimes, period-correct currency that had not seen circulation in decades. Beneath the money, resting flat against the bottom of the tin, was a thick sealed envelope made of heavy parchment paper. The military medal bore the date Mortninchin Mi Tam. The engraved silver thimble was heavy and cold. The implication was staggering. The woman who had taught her the delicate art of tailoring, the quiet woman in Fall River, had roots in this ruined building. Hazel did not open the envelope. The weight of the discovery, the sheer improbability of it all, was too profound to absorb in the dim fading light of the shop. She placed the tools, the patterns, and the tin box carefully back into the iron compartment, replacing the panel and locking it with the bobbin key. She walked outside. The night was bitterly cold, the sky clear and brilliant with stars. She walked to the edge of the property, where the Taunton River met the dark salt marsh. She stood there for a long time, listening to the water moving against the muddy bank. She did not feel the cold. She felt a profound settling stillness. The frantic energy of the past 6 weeks, the desperate scramble for survival, seemed to drain away into the dark water. She had arrived. She did not know what the letter contained, but she knew that the morning would bring a new reality. She waited for daylight, her breath rising in white plumes, watching the stars turn slowly over the deep river valley. Some trades are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The morning broke grey and bitterly cold, the pale light filtering through the plastic sheeting in the main shop. Hazel woke with the first light, the fire in the wood stove having burned down to white ash and glowing orange coals. She fed it a thick piece of hickory, watching the flames catch and rise. When the room began to warm, she went to the treadle stand. She used the bobbin key, pulled away the heavy iron panel, and brought the metal cigar tin back to the stove. She sat on the floor, the tin resting between her knees. She removed the heavy silver thimble and the silver military medal. Placing them carefully on the floorboards, she lifted the stacks of old currency. Beneath them lay the thick parchment envelope. The paper was stiff, yellowed at the edges by decades of confinement. There was no name written on the outside, only the date, November Mihai Motninchin Sautam. She slid her thumbnail under the sealed flap. The glue gave way with a dry tearing sound. Inside were 4 sheets of heavy stationery, covered in a dense, meticulous script written in dark blue fountain pen ink. Hazel recognized the handwriting instantly. It was the same precise and unhurried script that had filled Beatrice Hale's measurement ledgers in Fall River, the same elegant forward-leaning letters. Her breath caught in her throat. She moved closer to the stove, angling the paper to catch the light, and began to read. My dear one, whoever you are. Mott write this from the small fitting room at the back of the shop, watching the first snow of the season settle over the dark waters of the Taunton River. Mott am writing to you because Mott know that one day, perhaps many years from now, someone will find this compartment. Mott built it for that precise purpose. Mott write to you because my hands are failing and the pain in my joints has grown too fierce to ignore. Last week, Mott travelled to Boston to see Dr. Thorne, a specialist at the University Hospital. He confirmed what Mott have suspected for over a year. The rheumatoid arthritis in my hands is severe and progressive. The cartilage is deteriorating. Within 5 years, my fingers will be completely crippled. For a woman whose entire life has been defined by the delicate perception of texture, by the precise tension of a thread and the cut of heavy wool, this is a profound and final sentence. A tailor who cannot hold a needle is a woman working in the dark. Mott must close the shop. Mott must pack my tools. Mott must leave the river. But Mott cannot take the history of this place with me. It does not belong entirely to me. It belongs to the lineage of hands that built it. My great-grandmother, Eleanor Hale, arrived in this valley in Montambon High, carrying only a set of hand-forged shears and a knowledge of English garment construction. She built the first bespoke tailoring business in the county, making sturdy wool coats for the fishermen. My grandmother, Margaret Hale, expanded the trade during the boom years of the textile mills in the Motam Tarmi Gay, sourcing the finest silk and linen from the eastern port. My mother, Catherine Hale, guided the business through the difficult years of the Great Depression, refusing to compromise the quality of her work even when the town had no money to pay her, and Mott, Beatrice Hale, inherited this legacy. But the legacy ends with me. The event that broke the chain did not happen in this town. It happened in Lawrence, 56 years ago. The event that broke the chain did not happen in this town. It happened in France, 50 years ago. My older brother, Thomas Hale, was 19 years old when he enlisted in the Marines. He had the best hands Mott had ever seen, patient, steady, with an intuitive understanding of drape and tension that took me decades to learn. Mott believed, with the quiet certainty of a sister, that he would take over the shop, that he would stand at Mott Faye's cutting tables and continue the work. But the telegram arrived in July of Motninchin Matam. Thomas was killed during the Battle of Belleau Wood on June Haimisau. The military sent back his personal effects, including the Bronze Star he was awarded posthumously. The medal is in the box with this letter. The silver thimble was the one he carried in his pocket for luck. Since that day, the shop has been silent in its soul. For over half a century, Mott have worked alone, surrounded by the ghosts of garments that will never be worn. The tools in this compartment are the finest Mott possess. They belong to my mother and to her mother before her. The patterns, the intricate architecture of clothing, were drafted before the world fell apart when quality was unmatched. Mott leave them here, sealed in the dark, because Mott cannot bear to sell them to strangers who do not understand their value, and Mott cannot bear to take them with me, where they will sit unused. If you are reading this, you have found the compartment. If you have found the compartment, you understand the mechanics of the machine. Mott ask only that you use these tools with the respect they demand. Remember that true wool must never be pressed with a dry iron, only steamed gently to shape the fibre. Remember that the bias cut of a fabric will stretch over time. Let it hang for at least 2 weeks before any final hemming is attempted. Remember that when you draft a pattern, you are not merely covering the body, you are shaping its movement. Cut the arm sky high, avoiding the bulk, and always listen to the tension of the thread. The craft is not in the strength of your hands, but in the patience of your eye. An inheritance is a heavy thing. It can be a burden, or it can be a foundation. Mott do not know your circumstances, but Mott know that if you are standing in this ruined shop, you are searching for something. Perhaps you are searching for a quiet place to work. Perhaps you are searching for a history to claim as your own. Mott leave you this money, these tools, and these walls. They are not much, but they are all Mott have left to give. Do not let the silence of this building frighten you. The silence is only the space between the stitches. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You are welcome here. November Mui Hai. Motnin Chin Sao Mi Tam. Hazel sat perfectly still. The fire hissed and popped in the wood stove. She read the letter again, tracing the elegant curves of the ink with her eyes, absorbing the profound weight of the words. It was a transmission across time, a deliberate reaching out from a woman who had known she was fading into silence. She had lived for decades in that small, cluttered workshop, sewing garments for a neighborhood that did not understand her history. And in the final years of her life, she had taken in a quiet, frightened teenage girl and taught her how to listen to the drape of the fabric. She had never told her about Fall River. She had never told her about Thomas. She had given her the craft, but she had kept her grief to herself. She folded the letter slowly, pressing her fingers along its original creases. She placed it back into the heavy envelope. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in years. But her chest felt tight, filled with a massive, swelling ache that was both sorrow and an overwhelming sense of profound gratitude. She stood up. The letter had mentioned the back of the property. She zipped her jacket, opened the heavy front doors, and walked around the side of the building to the overgrown yard behind the shop. The frost had melted slightly in the mid-morning sun, turning the earth soft and muddy. She pushed her way through the dense blackberry brambles, ignoring the thorns that tore at her jeans. Near the back property line, resting beneath the sprawling canopy of an ancient white oak, she found it was a small, unpolished block of grey granite, half buried in the earth and covered in pale green lichen. It was not a formal grave. Thomas was buried in France, or perhaps in a military cemetery, but a cenotaph, a physical marker placed by a grieving sister. Hazel knelt in the damp earth. She used her bare hands to pull away the dead leaves and the encroaching ivy. The carved letters were shallow, worn smooth by decades of rain and snow, but they were still legible. Thomas Hale. Motnin tam chin machin mot chin mui tam. His hands were steady. Hazel stayed by the stone until the cold began to numb her fingers. When she returned to the shop, the silence inside did not feel empty or hostile. It felt expectant. She walked to the treadle stand and retrieved a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth that she had missed in her initial inventory. She unwrapped it. It was an old brass kerosene lamp, its glass chimney intact but coated in a fine layer of soot. She wiped the glass clean with the edge of her jacket, filled the reservoir with a small bottle of lamp oil she had purchased from Elias, and trimmed the wick with her utility knife. She struck a match and touched it to the cotton. The flame caught, blooming into a warm, steady yellow light. It pushed back the deep shadows of the cavernous room, illuminating the heavy oak of the cutting tables and the gleaming steel of the tailoring tools on the floor. Hazel watched the flame burn. It did not flicker. It was a small, defiant point of light in a building that had been dark for decades. Sitting in the glow of the lamp, she thought about the improbable chain of events that had brought her to this specific coordinate on the map. She thought about the waitress in New Bedford who had let her sleep in the booth and brought her a plate of hot fries. She thought about the librarian in Providence who had silently handed her a pen and a piece of paper, asking no questions about her worn boots or her exhaustion. She thought about Martha Higgins at the county clerk's office, who had warned her but had stamped the deed anyway, handing over the keys with a quiet look of understanding. And she thought of Beatrice Hale, an old woman who had recognized a frightened girl's need for quiet and had taught her the only language she fully understood. Before we continue, if you have ever been the recipient of a small, unexpected kindness from a stranger, tell us about it in the comments below. Sometimes it is the smallest gestures, the quiet allowances made by people who owe us nothing, that alter the trajectory of our lives the most. That night, Hazel did not sleep on the hard floor of the back office. She brought her canvas duffel bag into the main hall. She laid it out near the woodstove where the radiant heat kept the bitter chill at bay. Beside her, resting on the smooth floorboards, she placed the heavy silver thimble and the sealed envelope containing Beatrice's letter. She closed her eyes. For the first time in 6 weeks, the exhausting hypervigilance did not grip her chest. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, anchored by the physical weight of the history resting beside her. The restoration of the shop did not begin with the delicate adjustments of a garment. It began with the brutal, unglamorous physics of structural triage. The most urgent threat was the sagging slate roof. The heavy snows of the New England winter were imminent, and if the compromised joists failed, the building would collapse inward, destroying the antique sewing machine and everything else. Hazel sat by the stove the next morning, a brown paper grocery bag spread flat across her knees. Using Elias Brothers' manual as a guide, she sketched the dimensions of the roof, calculating the load-bearing requirements for the compromised section. The math was complex, involving angles of deflection and the tensile strength of dimensional lumber. She worked slowly, checking her figures twice. She needed heavy timber to sister the cracked rafters, to bolt new structurally sound wood directly alongside the failing beams. She took a portion of the cash from the cigar tin, 3 $20 bills, and walked back to Hanson & Sons Supply. Elias reviewed her paper bag schematic, his heavy brows furrowing. "You resistering the joists," he observed, tracing her pencil lines with a thick finger. "That's the right call, but you can't use standard 2x4s for a span that wide. They look lunk bow under the snow load. You need rough sawn oak, full dimension. It's heavy work." "Mott can do it," Hazel said. Elias looked at her, assessing her slight frame. He did not offer pity or doubt, only practical reality. "You look lunk need lag bolts, 1/2-inch diameter and heavy steel washers. You look lunk have to pre-drill the holes. And you can to lift those timbers alone a ladder." He paused, closing the green ledger. "My nephew Caleb is 17. Big kid. He helps out at his dad's fishing boat, but things are slow in the winter. Mort can send him over with the lumber truck tomorrow morning. You pay him $5 for the day to help you lift." "Thank you, Elias." The interactions with Elias Hanson at Mort, the hardware store, became the only structured social contact in Hazel's isolated routine. Elias was not a conversationalist. His communication was transactional, focused entirely on the practical requirements of the building. When Hazel walked through the heavy glass doors, the bell chiming overhead, he did not ask about her past or comment on her exhausted appearance. He simply opened the heavy green canvas ledger, laid it flat on the counter, and waited for her list. Mort need to address the structural sag in the roof joists, Hazel told him on a bitter Tuesday morning, the wind howling outside the frosted windows of the supply store. The main support beam over the cutting tables is compromised. It's bowed at least 3 inches off center. Elias nodded slowly, his calloused fingers tapping against the counter. He understood the severity of the problem immediately. A bowed main beam in a building that age was a catastrophic failure waiting for a heavy snow load to finalize it. "You can just jack it up," Elias said, his voice a low rumble. "You push that old pine too fast. It let Noah pay like a dry bone. You have to sister it with new lumber, and you have to raise it slow, over a period of weeks." He walked back into the dense aisles of the store, motioning for her to follow. He led her to a section stacked Verkepte Hart heavy rough sawn lumber. He pulled a massive piece of white oak from the... It was a true 2x10, not the milled down modern equivalent, heavy and dense with tight growth rings. "This is structural grade," Elias said, running his hand along the rough edge. "It one T-bow, but it weighs 100 pounds. You look like need 2 of these, bolted on either side of the cracked beam." He then led her to the hardware aisle. He did not hand her modern bright zinc screws. He handed her heavy dull iron lag bolts 1/2 inch thick and 6 inches long, along with massive square steel washers. "You drill through the old wood, right through to the other side. You bolt the new oak on either side, sandwiching the broken beam. You tighten it down day by day. Let the building adjust to the new tension." He totaled the materials on his paper pad. The cost was substantial, pushing her ledger balance well past $200. Hazel watched him write the numbers, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. Elias closed the ledger and looked at her. "You have a jack?" he asked. Hazel shook her head. "No." Elias walked to the back corner of the store, near the loading dock, and returned carrying a heavy, rusted mechanical screwjack. It was an antique tool, forged iron, designed for lifting locomotives and heavy timber frames. It must have weighed 50 pounds. He set it on the counter with a heavy thud. "This belonged to my grandfather," Elias said. It S-geared low. "You can lift a house with it, if you have the patience. You take it. Bring it back when the roof is straight." He did not add the jack to the ledger. He simply pushed it across the counter. It was an unspoken acknowledgement of the magnitude of her task, a silent vote of confidence from a man who did not offer trust lightly. Hazel carried the massive jack and the heavy hardware back to the shop, her arms burning, the weight of the iron grounding her in the reality of the work ahead. Caleb arrived at 8 the next morning, driving a battered Ford flatbed. He was a quiet, broad-shouldered teenager who moved with the awkward, powerful grace of someone accustomed to heavy physical labor. Together they spent the day wrestling the massive rough-sawn oak timbers up the creaking interior stairs to the attic space. The work was brutal. The air in the attic was thick with decades of dust and the sharp, sour smell of damp wood. Hazel used a chalk line coated in blue powder to snap a perfectly straight reference mark across the existing sagging joists. She measured the required stagger for the joints, ensuring that no 2 connection points aligned on adjacent beams, a technique she had studied for hours in the manual to maximize structural integrity. Caleb held the heavy timbers in place, his face red Verkepte Hat exertion, while Hazel drove the 1/2-inch lag bolts through the pre-drilled holes using a heavy socket wrench. It took 11 days to complete the work. Hazel worked alone for 10 of them, driving the heavy Muisao penny nails to secure the cross-bracing. She developed a rhythm, a physical economy of motion, set the nail, a light tap to start it, a heavy blow to drive it deep, and a final precise strike to set the head flush with the wood. The 3-stroke nail, her hands blistered then calloused, the skin growing thick and rough. When the final bolt was tightened, she stood back. The roof no longer sagged. The heavy oak beams stood rigid and unyielding against the ceiling, a permanent correction to decades of neglect. With the roof secured against collapse, she turned her attention to the exterior of the chimney. The sweep had cleared the flue, but the mortar between the bricks on the exterior shaft was crumbling, compromised by years of freeze and thaw cycles. If she did not repoint the joints, the winter moisture would penetrate the brick, freezing and expanding until the entire structure fractured. It was mid-December and the temperature rarely rose above the low 20s. Working with mortar in freezing conditions was a delicate, frustrating process. Standard modern cement would freeze before it could cure, losing all its strength. Hazel consulted Elias S. manual again. It detailed a historic mortar mix used in the late 19th century, a high proportion of hydrated lime mixed with sharp sand and rainwater, which cured slower and remained slightly flexible, accommodating the natural shifting of old brick. For the firebox itself, she needed a specialized fireclay that could withstand extreme temperatures. She hauled a heavy bag of lime and 3 bags of sand up the exterior stairs. She mixed the mortar in small batches in a plastic bucket, adding warm water she heated on the wood stove to keep the mixture pliable. The work was agonizingly slow. She stood on the icy roof, the wind whipping around her, using a narrow pointing trowel to scrape out the loose crumbly mortar, then pressing the fresh lime mix deep into the joints. Her bare hands went numb every 15 minutes. She would climb down the stairs, sit by the stove until feeling returned as a sharp, stinging pain, and then climb back up. She spent 3 weeks on the chimney, working only during the brief hours of midday when the sun offered a faint illusion of warmth. She developed a profound respect for the masons who had originally built the structure, for the sheer physical endurance required to lay brick high above the ground. By late January, the pointing was complete. The new mortar lines were pale grey against the dark red brick, a visible scar of repair. She waited 4 days for the mortar to cure, keeping a careful watch on the sky for snow. On a Tuesday afternoon, she built a massive test fire in the wood stove, loading it with heavy oak logs. She went outside and watched the chimney. The smoke rose in a thick, straight column, drafting perfectly. There were no leaks, no smoke seeping through the joint. The shaft held the heat. The chimney was sound. The foundation of any working shop is the floor. It must be perfectly level to support the massive oak cutting tables, and it must be sealed to prevent heavy woolen déueté from embedding into the grain. The floorboards in the main room were massive planks of old-growth eastern white pine, some measuring a full 20 inches wide. They were fastened directly to the heavy floor joists verkepite heart hand-cut iron rose head nails. Time and moisture had severely damaged large sections near the broken windows, rotting the wood through to the subfloor. Hazel spent late January prying up the damaged sections using a long iron crowbar. The hand-cut nails shrieked as they were pulled free, resisting with the stubborn strength of forged iron. She replaced the rotted boards with salvaged pine planks of similar vintage, securing them with new square-cut masonry nails that closely mimicked the holding power of the originals. When the structural integrity was restored, she faced the monumental task of resurfacing. The floor was covered in a thick, uneven layer of hardened grime, spilled dye and deep scratches from heavy casters. She rented a massive drum-style floor sander from Elias at the hardware store. It cost $14 a day, a significant expense that cut deeply into her remaining funds. The machine was a heavy, violently loud beast that required all her strength to control. It pulled forward with immense torque, threatening to gouge deep trenches into the pine if she let it linger in one spot for even a second. She wore a heavy canvas mask to block the dust, but the fine wood flour coated her hair, her clothes, and everything in the room. She made 3 full passes across the entire expanse of the hall. The first pass, using an aggressive 80 grit paper, tore through the grime and the top layer of darkened wood. The second pass, with 120 grit, leveled the surface and removed the heavy scratches left by the first. The final pass, using a fine 220 grit paper, polished the pine to a smooth pale finish. It took 4 exhausting days of continuous noise and vibration. When the dust finally settled and she had swept the floor clean, the transformation was staggering. The wood glowed with a warm, pale honey color, the tight grain of the old-growth pine revealed for the first time in decades. She sealed the floor using pure tung oil, a traditional finish that penetrated deep into the wood rather than sitting on the surface. She thinned the first coat by 25% with mineral spirits to ensure maximum penetration, applying it on her hands and knees with a heavy cotton rag. She applied 3 coats in total, waiting 48 hours between each application for the oil to cure and harden. The work broke her down. There was one morning in early February when she woke with her hands so swollen and raw that she could not close her fingers around her coffee cup. Her back ached with a deep, grinding pain that radiated down her leg. The sheer scale of the building, the endless succession of physical demands, felt suddenly and overwhelmingly insurmountable. She did not work that day. She put on her coat and walked away from the shop. She walked down the steep incline behind the building until she reached the edge of the salt marsh, where the Taunton River widened out toward the bay. She sat on a large flat rock, pulling her knees to her chest, and stared at the grey, freezing water. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, its long legs like brittle reeds in the ice-rimmed water. She watched the bird for a long time, entirely unconcerned with the weight of the world, focused only on the immediate necessity of striking a fish. Hazel sat there for 3 hours, watching the tide move slowly through the marsh grass. She did not think about the roof or the chimney or the floor. She just watched the water. When she returned to the shop, the pain in her hands was still there, but the crushing weight in her chest had lifted. The process of sanding the massive pine floorboards was not merely physical labour, it was an act of archaeological excavation. The drum sander Elias had rented to her was a terrifying piece of machinery. It was heavy, unbalanced, and required absolute concentration to operate. The spinning drum, wrapped in aggressive 80-grit sandpaper, spun at high speed, ready to tear deep gouges into the antique wood if she allowed the machine to rest in one place for even a fraction of a second. Hazel started in the back corner of the main room, near the rusted dress forms. She engaged the lever, lowering the spinning drum onto the floor while simultaneously walking forward. The machine roared, a deafening vibration that rattled her teeth and sent a massive plume of white pine dust into the air. The heavy canvas mask she wore offered minimal protection. Within minutes, she could taste the sharp, resinous flavour of the old growth wood in the back of her throat. As she made her first pass down the length of the room, the years of neglect began to strip away. The floor had been coated in decades of accumulated grime, spilled sizing starch, oxidized machine oil, and the ground in dirt of 1,000 muddy boots. The coarse sandpaper chewed through this black crust, revealing the pale, dense wood beneath. It was a violent, noisy process, but the results were immediately profoundly satisfying. The physical toll was immense. Controlling the sander required her to lean back slightly, using her body weight to counter the forward pull of the drum. Her forearms cramped within the first hour, her lower back burned with a constant dull ache. But she could not stop. The rental fee was $14 a day, and she had to return the machine by closing time. She worked through the pain, establishing a relentless walking rhythm, moving back and forth across the cavernous room like a farmer ploughing a field. The dust was pervasive. It settled on the exposed brick walls, coated the windows, and hung in the air like a thick, dry fog. Every 2 hours, she had to stop, turn off the machine, and spend 30 minutes sweeping the massive piles of wood flour into heavy trash bags. The volume of material removed from the floor was staggering. When the first aggressive pass was complete, she changed the paper to a finer 120 grit. This pass was smoother, less violent, designed to remove the deep scratches left by the 80 grit paper and level the surface of the planks. She could begin to see the true character of the wood now. The tight growth rings of the old-growth pine swirled in complex patterns, punctuated by dark, dense knots. The wood had a natural luminosity that modern, fast-grown lumber lacked. The final pass, using a fine 220 grit paper, polished the wood until it felt smooth as glass beneath her calloused fingertips. She turned off the machine. The sudden silence in the shop was deafening. She dropped to her knees, her muscles trembling vekepite exhaustion, and ran her bare hand across the center of the room. The pine was completely transformed. It was no longer a rotting, dangerous trap. It was a beautiful, solid foundation ready to support the heavy oak cutting tables once again. She sat on the newly polished wood, surrounded by the settling dust, and allowed herself a brief, quiet moment of absolute pride. The final barrier to the outside world was the glass. The shop had 8 massive double-hung windows, each measuring 6 feet tall to let in maximum light for precise hand-stitching. 3 sashes were completely devoid of glass, the panes long since shattered by vandals or coastal storms. 4 windows contained heavily cracked panes taped over with brittle, yellowed masking tape. Only 1 window retained its original glass, a heavy machine-rolled pane from the early 20th century, distinguished by its subtle wavy distortions that warped the view of the trees outside. Hazel spent the second half of February rebuilding the window sashes. She carefully removed the heavy wooden frames from their casings, laying them flat on the newly finished floor. She stripped the old rock-hard glazing putty using an electric heat gun, working slowly to avoid scorching the wood or shattering the remaining glass. She measured the empty openings precisely and ordered replacement float glass from Elias. Glazing a window is a task of meticulous repetition. She pressed a thin bed of DAP 33 glazing compound into the wooden rabbet, set the new glass pane into place, and secured it with small metal glazing points driven into the wood with a putty knife. Then came the true test of skill, applying the final bevel of putty. She rolled the compound in her hands until it was warm and pliable, pressed it around the perimeter of the glass, and drew her knife smoothly along the edge, creating a perfectly angled seal that would shed water. It took dozens of attempts to achieve a clean, unbroken line. She rehung the sashes using heavy braided cotton cord, tying a specific figure-8 knot at the ends to secure the cast-iron counterweights hidden inside the window casings. When the last sash was installed, she removed the thick plastic sheeting that had darkened the shop for 3 months. The space was suddenly flooded at pale clear winter light. On the morning of February 20th, Hazel stood in the centre of the room. Through the new, clear glass of the east window, she watched a black-capped chickadee land on the sill, its head turning sharply as it inspected the unfamiliar reflection. The shop was no longer a tomb, it was a space that let the world in on its own terms. With the envelope of the building sealed against the elements, Hazel addressed the interior walls. The walls were constructed using traditional horsehair plaster applied over wooden lath strips. It was a durable insulating finish, but years of moisture leaking from the compromised roof had caused it to fail in 3 large patches near the chimney. The plaster had detached from the lath, crumbling into a chalky mess on the floor. Repairing historic plaster is not a matter of simply patching a hole with drywall compound. It requires rebuilding the structural layers. Hazel carefully chipped away the loose, compromised material until she reached sound plaster. She vacuumed the exposed wooden lath, removing decades of dust, and then sprayed the wood heavily with water to prevent it from absorbing moisture too quickly from the new mix. Following the manual, she applied a thick scratch coat of structurally reinforced plaster, pressing it firmly through the gaps in the lath to create a mechanical bond, the keys that held the wall together. When the scratch coat was partially set, she scored the surface with a nail to provide traction for the next layer. The brown coat followed, levelling the surface flush with the surrounding wall. Finally, she applied a thin, smooth finish coat, troweling it flat with a wide steel blade. She stood back, her arms aching from the repetitive upward motion, white plaster dust coating her face and arms. She looked at the smooth, seamless repairs near the chimney. They were not perfect, but they were solid. They were integrated into the history of the building. These patches will hold another 100 years, she thought. Some trades are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The restoration of the shop was an intensely solitary endeavour, but Hazel's presence on the edge of town did not go unnoticed. Fall River was a place that respected hard, physical labour, and the townspeople observed her steady, solitary progress with a growing, silent approval. It began with Doris Miller, the owner of the diner on the main thoroughfare. Doris was a woman of formidable presence, possessing a sharp tongue and a deep, unyielding practicality. Hazel had stopped by the diner twice a week throughout the winter, ordering nothing but black coffee and sitting in the back booth. Doris never asked questions. But in late February, Hazel walked out the front doors of the shop to find a heavy aluminum pan sitting on the top step covered tightly in aluminum foil. Inside was a massive portion of baked cod, dense with butter and breadcrumbs and a side of roasted potatoes. When Hazel tried to pay for it the next day, placing a $2 bill on the diner counter, Doris pushed it back with a single manicured finger. "Save it for nails," Doris said, turning back to the grill. The aluminum pans appeared on the step every Sunday morning thereafter. Caleb, the teenager who had helped sister the roof joists, became another fixture. He arrived every Saturday morning in his father's flatbed truck, the bed-loaded Vay-Kepte hat, split hickory and oak firewood. He would spend an hour stacking it neatly against the back wall of the shop, working in comfortable silence. Hazel usually brought him a cup of coffee when he finished. One crisp morning in March, as he pulled off his heavy leather work gloves, he gestured toward the main room. "My mother said," Caleb began, his voice hesitant, searching for the right words. "She said her grandmother used to bring her formal dresses here. Said there was an old woman who could make the fabric fall like water. About your grandmother, Motmeen, or whoever owned this place before." Hazel nodded slowly. She did not correct his assumption about her lineage. She was a good woman, she said. Caleb nodded in return, satisfied, and got back into his truck. Then there was Reverend Boyd, the pastor of the small Methodist church down the road. He was a tall, impossibly thin man who took a daily constitutional walk that brought him past the shop just as the sun broke over the river. He never stopped to preach or inquire about Hazel's. He would simply pause at the edge of the dirt road, leaning lightly on his walking stick, and watch her work on the exterior trim or sweep the front steps. "May the day be a kindly one, Miss Vance," he would say, touching the brim of his hat before continuing his walk. His brief, consistent presence was a steadying rhythm in the long, quiet days. In the early days of April, with the heavy structural work complete, Hazel turned her attention to the crawl space beneath the main floor. The access hatch was located in the small back office, a heavy square of pine set flush with the floorboard. She pried it open and lowered herself into the dark, damp space beneath the building. It was cramped, the heavy floor joists resting mere feet above the packed earth. She crawled slowly, a flashlight clamped in her teeth, inspecting the masonry piers that supported the structure. The brick piers were sound, but as she moved toward the front of the building, her light swept across an anomaly. Attached to the side of a massive oak beam, completely hidden from view unless one was lying directly beneath it, was a small, perfectly round disc of aromatic cedar. Carved into the surface of the cedar was a deep, precise outline of a pair of tailor shears. Hazel reached up. The disc was secured by a heavy brass screw. She turned the disc slightly. It moved with a smooth, oiled friction, revealing a shallow cavity carved directly into the oak joist. Inside the cavity rested a narrow, unvarnished oak box. Hazel pulled it free. It was surprisingly heavy. She crawled back to the hatch, pushing the box up onto the floor before climbing out. She sat on the floor of the office and opened the small brass clasp. Inside rested a heavy brass key, exactly 3 inches long. The bow of the key, the part held by the fingers, was cast in the distinct asymmetrical shape of a tailoress shear handle. It was a beautiful custom-forged piece of hardware, dark with tarnished age. Beneath the key lay a small rectangular piece of dark metal. Hazel lifted it carefully by the edges. It was a tintype photograph, a process common in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The image was remarkably clear, protected from light and moisture for over half a century. It showed a young woman, perhaps 25 years old, standing in front of the very brick shop Hazel now occupied. The painted sign above the doors read Halle Dressmaker. The woman was wearing a heavy, dark dress typical of the turn of the century. Her expression was serious, her jaw set with a quiet determination. In her right hand, resting against her skirt, she held a large, professional-grade rotary cutter. Hazel turned the tintype over. Written on the back in faded, looping script was a single line: Catherine Hale, daughter of Margaret, age Jaime Lum, summer of Motnin Chin Ba. Hazel looked from the photograph to the heavy brass key. Catherine Hale. a woman holding a Master S tool, standing proudly before a business in an era when women were rarely afforded such independence. Hazel traced the outline of the rotary cutter in the photograph with her thumb. She took the heavy brass key and placed it on the mantel above the wood stove, where it caught the morning light. It sat there for months, a silent question waiting for an answer. The food deliveries from Doris Miller were not simply acts of charity, they were a quiet, sustained lifeline. As the brutal New England winter dragged into late February, Hazel S. physical reserves were severely depleted. The constant shivering cold and the massive caloric burn of hauling lumber, mixing mortar and running the floor sander had stripped away what little weight she carried. She was living almost entirely on cheap oatmeal and heavily watered-down coffee. Doris, from her vantage point behind the diner counter, observed this slow deterioration with the sharp, unsentimental eye of a woman who had seen her share of hard times. She did not offer sympathy, which Hazel would have rejected. She offered dense, practical sustenance. The heavy aluminum pans began to appear with regular frequency, always left on the top step of the shop just before dusk. Inside, Hazel would find meals designed specifically to restore caloric deficit: thick, creamy clam chowder packed veille épité potatoes, massive cuts of roasted pork shoulder sitting in deep pools of rich gravy, heavy squares of baked macaroni and cheese crusty with burnt edges. Doris never knocked. She never waited for thanks, she simply left the food and returned to the diner. One Tuesday evening, the wind howling fiercely off the Taunton River, Hazel opened the front doors to find Doris herself standing on the step, wrapped in a heavy wool coat, holding a large insulated thermos. "The wind's shifting to the east," Doris said abruptly, pushing the thermos into Hazel's hands. "Means a heavy freeze is coming off the bay. That beef stew. Eat it while it's hot." Doris. "Mort can't keep taking this," Hazel said, her voice raspy. "Mort owe Elias for materials. Mort can't add a diner tab to the ledger." Doris pulled her coat tighter against the wind. She looked at Hazel, then past her, into the dim interior of the shop where the wood stove glowed and the newly oiled floors caught the light. "Mort grew up in this town," Doris said, her voice losing its usual sharp edge. "My mother worked the looms in the granite mill down the street. She worked 14-hour shifts, deafened by the noise, breathing cotton dust until her lungs gave out at 45. She bought exactly one custom-made dress in her entire life. She bought it here, from Beatrice Hale. It was dark blue wool, and she wore it to every wedding and every funeral until the day she died." Doris looked back at Hazel. This town has watched everything it built get packed up and shipped away. We retired of empty buildings. We retired of rot. She tapped the thermos in Hazel's hands. "You refixing the rot. The stew is free. Eat it." Doris turned and walked back down the dirt road toward the town, leaning heavily into the east wind. Hazel stood in the doorway, the heavy thermos radiating heat against her chest. She closed the doors, secured the padlock, and walked back to the wood stove. She poured the thick, dark stew into her tin cup. She ate it slowly, tasting the rich, savory broth, feeling the profound, unexpected warmth of a community that was quietly deciding to claim her as its own. Spring arrived in coastal Massachusetts not with a sudden burst of warmth, but as a slow, agonizing thaw. The heavy sea ice on Mount Hope Bay began to break apart, turning the marsh at the edge of the property into a rushing torrent of tidal water. The hard, frozen earth softened, giving way to the brilliant, startling green of emerging beach grass and the pale white blossoms of the scrub oaks that lined the surrounding woods. The air lost its sharp, metallic bite, replaced by the deep, rich scent of wet loam and decaying salt hay. Hazel opened the heavy front doors of the shop and left them wide open. She unlatched the newly glazed windows, pushing the heavy sashes up to let the crisp, damp sea air circulate through the vast space. The shop breathed. The smell of old dust and dry rot was finally purged, carried away by the Atlantic breeze. She stood in the centre of the room, looking at the monumental amount of work she had accomplished in 5 months. The roof was secure, the chimney drew perfectly, the floors gleamed with the pale gold of oiled pine. The massive shattered space had been wrestled back from the brink of collapse and transformed into a sanctuary of light and clean wood. The rusted dress forms stood silently in the corners, their iron frames waiting. The tools remained securely wrapped in oiled canvas inside the treadle machine. She had survived the winter, she had secured the structure, but she made a conscious, deliberate decision that morning. She would not begin the delicate work of garment construction this spring. She would not touch the shears or the tailoring chalk yet. She knew the mechanics of a seam, she had watched Beatrice Hale for years, but she also knew that watching was not the same as doing. The craft required a depth of understanding, a sensitivity in the fingertips and the eye, that could not be rushed. She would spend the summer studying the patterns Beatrice had left behind. She would read the meticulous measurement ledgers. She would learn the precise geometry of drape and bias before she ever applied a blade to a piece of wool. The shop had waited decades for the right hands to return. It did not need her to hurry, it needed her to be precise. She walked to the open doors and looked out at the scrub oaks blooming against the dark water of the river. The dressmaker shop was patient. So was she. 2 full winters passed before Hazel Vance completed her first full bespoke commission. It was a massive, heavily structured winter overcoat built from 24 ounces of densely woven Melton wool. The client was Caleb, who had grown into a broad-shouldered young man working the freezing decks of his father's commercial fishing boat. The coat required over 300 hours of meticulous, agonizingly slow labor. Hazel had drafted the pattern entirely by hand, adjusting the armsky to allow for the heavy reaching movements required on a boat. She had pad-stitched the horsehair canvas interlining by hand, thousands of tiny, invisible stitches that gave the lapel a permanent, graceful roll that could never be achieved by modern fusing. She had bound the buttonholes in heavy silk twist, working the thread tightly over the raw edges of the wool. On a cold morning in late November, 2 years after she had arrived in Fall River, Caleb stood in the centre of the shop and slipped the coat over his shoulders. The fit was absolute. It moved with him seamlessly, a piece of architectural armour designed to withstand the brutal Atlantic winter. It was a garment built to outlast its owner. The interior of the shop had evolved into a space of deliberate, organised purpose. The massive pine floorboards were deeply polished, showing the scuffs and marks of daily work. The wood stove in the corner burned steadily, a constant source of dry, radiant heat. The cutting tables were meticulously organised, the hand-forged tools arranged in neat, accessible rows. Beatrice Hale's master shears rested in a specialised leather case Hazel had crafted herself. The cast-iron treadle stand still sat in the corner, its hollow leg serving as a secure, climate-controlled storage vault for her most sensitive silk patterns. The heavy brass key, shaped like a shear handle, still sat on the mantelpiece above the stove. It was on the afternoon she finished Caleb's heavy winter coat that Hazel finally solved the mystery of the key. She had carried it with her often, studying the intricate wards and the unique, heavy bow shaped like a shear handle. She had tried it in every rusted lock, every antique cabinet, every forgotten drawer in the building. It fit none of them. That afternoon, seeking a moment of quiet after the intense concentration of the final pressing, she walked out the back door and into the woods behind the shop. She walked past the granite cenotaph marking Thomas Hale's memory, venturing deeper into the scrub oak and pine that clung to the slope above the salt marsh. About 50 yards past the property line stood a massive northern red oak tree. Its trunk was over 4 feet in diameter, its deeply furrowed bark scarred by a century of coastal storms. Near the base of the tree, partially hidden by the fluted roots, Hazel noticed a small irregularity in the bark. She knelt in the damp leaves and brushed the dirt away, set flush into the dense oak wood, seamlessly integrated as if the tree had grown around it, was a small square brass plate featuring a heavy keyhole. Hazel's heart accelerated. She reached into her pocket and retrieved the heavy brass key. She inserted it into the brass plate. It slid in via capite heart abs. Machined precision. She turned it. The mechanism was stiff, resisting at first, but then it yielded with a dull, heavy click. A small section of the brass plate swung outward on a hidden hinge, revealing a hollowed-out cavity deep within the heartwood of the oak tree. The cavity was lined with thick oiled leather to keep out moisture and insects. Inside rested a carefully folded American flag. Hazel pulled it out gently. It was made of heavy cotton bunting, the colours faded but still distinct. She counted the stars in the blue canton. There were 48. It was a flag from an era before Alaska and Hawaii, the flag that had draped the coffins of the First World War. Tucked into the folds of the heavy cotton was a small, stiff index card. The handwriting was elegant, though different from Beatrice's script. To the one who holds the key, the card read, "My son Thomas was lost in the woods of below. June Jaime Sao, Motnin Chin Mi Tam. His sister cannot bear to look upon the colours that claimed him. Mot hide them here, in the roots of this coast, until the day the grief has settled. Margaret Hale." Hazel held the flag to her chest. She looked back at the brick shop, partially visible through the bare branches. The history of the place was not just a collection of tools and techniques. It was a dense, intertwined narrative of loss and preservation, a silent contract between generations. The following June, on the 26th day of the month, Hazel took the silver military medal she had found in the cigar tin and drove to the county Veterans Memorial. She pinned the tarnished bronze star to the bulletin board at the entrance, a quiet acknowledgement of the young man, with the steady hands who had never returned to take his place at the cutting table. She returned to the shop. The cigar tin still sat in the cast-iron leg. Of the $712 left by Beatrice Hale, Hazel had spent exactly 3 silver dimes. She had used them at the public library in Providence to pay for the postage that mailed her $4 bid to the county clerk. She placed the remaining currency, the antique bills and the heavy silver coins, back into the tin box. She locked the tin and set it deep inside the sealed compartment. It was not her money to spend. It was an endowment, a foundation for the building itself. She loyepte it there for the next one. She did not take out an advertisement in the local newspaper or paint a new sign for the front of the building. She simply wrote her name and phone number on a small ruled index card and pinned it to the corkboard near the cash register at Doris S. Diner. The card read, "Hazel Vance. Bespoke tailoring and alterations." Word spread through the county with the slow, deliberate pace of a coastal season. By the end of her 3rd year, she had a waiting list of over 40 clients. They brought her torn woolen peacoats from the fishing fleet, vintage silk wedding dresses that had survived decades in cedar chests, and heavy canvas sailbags that required hand-stitching. They brought them to the edge of town, down the dirt road to the brick shop, trusting the young woman with the calloused hands and the quiet demeanour to find the shape beneath the damage. One afternoon in late October, Caleb pulled his father's flatbed truck up to the front doors. He was 19 now, broader and taller, his hands marked by the constant work of the sea. He did not have a delivery of firewood. He walked up the steps carrying a heavy piece of rough sawn white oak beautifully sanded and finished with oil. He held it up for her to see. It was a new sign for the building. The letters were deeply carved into the wood, painted a stark, crisp white. Hazel Vance Dressmaking. And daughters. Hazel looked at the sign, then at Caleb. "Mot Donty have daughters?" "Caleb," she said softly. Caleb smiled, a slow, genuine expression that reached his eyes. "My father always said you build a sign for what you want a place to become, not just what it is today," he replied, leaning the heavy wood against the brick facade. "This building is going to be here a long time, Miss Vance. There's room for more than one." That evening, after the wood stove was stoked and the shop had settled into its familiar creaking rhythm, Hazel sat at her desk in the back office. She took out a single sheet of heavy parchment paper and a fountain pen she had purchased in town. She unscrewed the cap. She looked out the window, watching the moonlight reflect off the frost gathering on the dry marsh grass. She pressed the nib of the pen to the paper. "My dear one, whoever you are," she wrote. Mott write this sitting in the back office of the shop, listening to the wind come off the Taunton River. "Mott am writing to you because Mott know that one day, long after my hands have stopped working, someone will find the compartment in the cast iron. Mott write to you because Mott know what it means to be adrift, and Mott know what it means to find an anchor in the dark. The tools in the canvas roll belong to a woman named Beatrice Hale, and to her mother before her. Use them with respect. Listen to the drape of the fabric. Some trades are not abandoned, only waiting for the right hands to find them. The Dressmaker S shop waits. It has always waited. And miles away, in the quiet, climate-controlled archives of the Bristol County Courthouse, sitting in the very back of a locked metal drawer, resting beneath a stack of forgotten transfer forms and outdated municipal blueprints, was a single, crumpled $4 bill.